Good afternoon. This will be a non-scholarly presentation, and it was originally differences between Tibetan Buddhism and Theravada, and for the sake of a more attractive title, we went to making sense of Buddhist traditions and vehicles. So these are vast topics, and I'll try to hit some essential key points and won't be able to avoid putting in some of my own opinions. So I'm begging forgiveness from the beginning from those who know a lot more than I do. So, what exactly is Tibetan Buddhism? I think when most people think of Tibetan Buddhism, they think of Tantra or Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, and thinking of Tantra may invoke some strange ideas, but actually Tibetan Buddhism contains all the paths and vehicles of Buddhism. It's a progression through the whole spectrum of Buddhist teachings and practices. So Tibetan Buddhism and Theravada have a lot in common, especially the foundation. Um, the talk of vehicles can be confusing, and when I was first disrobed from being a Theravada monk and in the spiritual supermarket of California, being exposed to all these things practically on a daily basis, um, I found it confusing and also somewhat offensive to hear talk of Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, and difficult to make sense of the Bodhisattva ideal in Mahayana, the great vehicle, and then Tibetan Buddhism, especially with all its richness and detail, was quite bewildering and not that attractive to me, frankly. And so these days, usually when Tibetan teachers talk about vehicles, they'll refer to foundational vehicle rather than lesser vehicle, which I think is a good choice. So the basic teachings of Buddhism always start with what's called the Four Noble Truths, um, that existence as we know it is basically suffering, and then the cause of suffering being desire that's informed by ignorance. Ignorance meaning not knowing the way things really are. And then the cessation of suffering, which comes about through ending desire, attachment, and ignorance. And then the path to do so, called the Eightfold Path. And with a lot of these enumerations, I'm not going to go into all the details. Um, there are always plenty of books that people can read. So basically, Four Noble Truths and the threefold training of morality or ethics, concentration or meditation, and wisdom or insight. Another foundational teaching, which especially my Theravada teacher, Ajahn Chah, emphasized, was impermanence. And with a little thought, I think it can be seen that because everything is impermanent and not stable, then relying on it for happiness is bound to lead to disappointment, frustration, and a lot of other worse conditions. Then also, obviously, the suffering of having a physical body. So Mahayana is basically the bodhisattva ideal, not just practicing for oneself and supposedly practicing on the path until all beings are liberated from suffering. And this also can lead to misconceptions. People would think, well, am I supposed to just stay in the world and live an ordinary life and have ordinary delusions and attachments for the sake of others? Well, it's not like that. It means attaining enlightenment for the benefit of others. And so you have the ability to benefit them. Or as the Buddha said, one drowning person can't rescue another drowning person. And there's a natural progression where first we examine existence and we see the unsatisfactoriness of it. We want to practice to attain liberation. And then maybe as time goes by, we start to look around or we hear some teachings about it and we realize everybody's in the same boat. And for beyond that, I am one, they are many. So it wouldn't be right just to focus on our own benefit when there are countless beings suffering just as we do, wanting happiness and not finding it because they don't know how to really find true happiness. Then practicing on the Mahayana path like that, the next logical step would be thinking, what can I do to speed up the process here? And that's where the skillful means of the tantric path or the Vajrayana diamond vehicle path would come in. And Vajrayana is usually called secret mantra Vajrayana, and I think everybody knows the term mantra now. Um, Mantra actually means mind protection, which is something to keep in mind, but it also means you could call them mystic formulas or whatever that we recite during the meditation practices. And with all the very complex practices in Tibetan Buddhism, especially with the deity visualizations, which I'll get into a little later, it's often emphasized that the mantra is the most important point. And you can think in terms of the senses of hearing and seeing, smelling, tasting, and touch, so forth, that hearing is, let's say, we hear things from all sides. You don't have to turn your attention as you do with seeing or touching or anything else. So sense of hearing is like a dominant sense. So these are things keep in mind as we go along. And you'll find traces and hints of teachings of Mahayana and Vajrayana in Theravada scriptures. And for example, the Bodhisattva ideal, well, that is present in Theravada, except that it's seen as a path for only one being per world cycle to follow, the one who becomes a Buddha in physical form. whereas in Mahayana, this is a path for everyone. And so another thing is the old saying that great minds think alike. And when you meet realized teachers, then no matter which tradition they're from, you'll likely to hear them saying very similar things. A few things that have struck me in recent years when listening to recordings of my first teacher, Ajahn Chah, in Thailand, was that he occasionally said things almost word for word the same as I've heard from the Dalai Lama or from other Tibetan teachers. So get into a little more into the vehicles. When I was first a layperson, maybe after half a year or so, I had the opportunity to have an interview with a senior Tibetan Lama, Gyaltsul Rinpoche, in California, and I told him about my puzzlement with the talk of vehicles, and with his limited English, he said, excuse the term, Hinayana, suffering means emphasizes suffering, Mahayana, compassion, Vajrayana, respect. And I didn't really know exactly what he meant by respect, but as years go by, things sometimes become clear. And I think he was talking about the one of the foundational premise, if you will, of Vajrayana is that everything is pure from the beginning, and every being has what's called the Buddha nature, the pure nature that is primordially present, meaning from the beginningless beginning, and is unborn and never changes or dies, and is always present through all our experience. And this is why we can practice this path, which is called the resultant path, which I'll get into in a few minutes. And one way I like to think of this is to say the sun is always shining. In other words, on a cloudy day, people will say the sun isn't shining or the sun isn't out. But of course, the sun is shining. It's just obscured by clouds. The sun didn't go anywhere. It didn't stop shining. So the original pure mind is like that. It's always shining, always present. And this is something to keep in mind. And the enlightened nature is sometimes talked about as emptiness, which is not a nothingness, but it's endowed with all positive enlightened qualities. And talking about the common points of the vehicles, a lot the same terminology is used, but sometimes the same terms will have different meaning. For example, Theravada talks about the middle way being, which in the Buddha's first teaching, the middle way between indulgence in sensual gratification or the other extreme of self-mortification, which was popular in spiritual circles in India at the Buddhist time, whereas in Mahayana and Vajrayana, and again, Vajrayana is Mahayana, it's called Tantra Mahayana rather than Sutra Mahayana. In Mahayana, middle way means freedom from the extremes of taking things to be substantially existing and taking them to be non-existing. Not to get too involved in scholarly terminology, I thought I would base a lot of this on one quotation from a text on the three levels of vows that's talking about the tantric path. It says the goal is the same, but in tantra there is no ignorance. There are many methods. There is little hardship, and it is for those of superior faculties. So, taking that last point with a grain of salt, um, I'll go into the first three, that there is no ignorance because it's what is called as the resultant path, using the result or enlightenment as the path, which um, may not make much sense just to hear about it, but um, taking the view, starting with intellectual understanding of the way things are, and then using the skillful means of the various meditation practices. And I'll talk specifically now about the deity practices because I think people might have had more exposure to these strange looking um, tantric deities that which are, you could say, reflections of an enlightened mind or representations in a form that we can use in practice. So, and it's emphasized that the deities are Buddhas or emanations or representations or reflections of Buddha mind, and sort of a bridge from the primordially pure nature to our ordinary experience. And these are called pure illusory forms. So they're still not ultimate, but they're still illusory, but they're pure, whereas ordinary experience is called impure illusory. So, and sometimes it's called example wisdom. In other words, they're not actually enlightenment itself, but sort of an example for us to meditate on. And because they're filled with the power and blessings of lineage coming from the primordial Buddha, then they can affect the mind powerfully, as can the mantras. And one of the great and popular teachers of the 20th century, Kalu Rinpoche, was talking about mantras once. He said, generally people don't have much trust in mantras and think, how does reciting some syllables, and usually Sanskrit syllables, help me or have anything to do with me or affect my mind? But he said, if you think about how we're affected by sounds, the ordinary sounds can disturb us or please us, and the sounds of praise and criticism the harsh words can affect our mind so strongly. So why wouldn't sounds that come from the source of enlightenment be able to affect our minds? So that's something to think about. And I'm talking specifically from the Nyingmapa tradition, which is one of the four main lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. And they all do have a lot in common. I'd say more in common than more differences. And also, the other three main lineages have elements of Nyingma because Nyingmapa came first, going back to 8th century when the Indian adept Padmasambhava, also known as Guru Rinpoche, the precious teacher, brought the Vajrayana teachings to Tibet. And one of the principles of Nyingmapa is talking about primordial purity, which I've mentioned, and spontaneous presence, which means that the primordial purity of emptiness is endowed with spontaneously accomplished qualities that don't have to be sought. They only need to be uncovered through the various skillful means of the practices. So, talking about the second point, there are many methods. In Theravada, there's a classic text called Visuddhimagga, or Path of Purification, that I think lists 40 methods of meditation. And in Vajrayana, there could be 40,000 or very possibly 40 million. And specifically talking about Nyingmapa again, have the tradition of what's called the hidden treasure teachings, or Dharma in Tibetan. And this is one of the very unique points of Nyingmapa that I'd like to talk about, is that Padmasambhava had 25 main disciples when he began teaching and also translating the tantric scriptures in Tibet, and being able to, he's called the knower of the three times, being able to see into the future. He sealed teachings that would be appropriate for the needs of beings at future times in the minds of his disciples, who would reincarnate as needed. And these are called mind dharma. There's also what's called earth dharma. There are also pure visions and other classes, but I'll stick to mind and earth treasures. And Padmasambhava and his chief of all disciples, the lady Yeshe Sogyal, traveled all throughout Tibet and also neighboring countries like Bhutan and Nepal, concealing treasures, which could be texts on parchment known as yellow scrolls, also statues, ritual objects, sacred substances, and these have often been revealed in front of large crowds of people. They're in rocks, in mountains, in caves, underwater, in statues, in pillars of temples. All sounds quite unbelievable, but these have been witnessed right up to modern times. And reading about this, I think, can give you a sense that this is not an ordinary tradition, not something to be taken lightly. And in that vein, one thing I'd like to say is that all these things can sound kind of mysterious, or people sometimes say medieval or Baroque. Um, but when you actually meet realized teachers, even before they speak a word, a lot of this starts to make sense. When I first met Ajahn Chah in Thailand, I'd been a floundering novice for 2 months in Bangkok, and he came to Bangkok. And the very first sight of him, the whole thing made sense. And I thought to myself, well, if all you have to do to be like that is sit in the forest for 30 years, it's certainly worth it. And of course, I didn't sit in the forest for 30 years, so I didn't become like that, but um, it seemed clear to me at the time. And I've met a lot of highly charismatic teachers of other traditions, but specifically when I met the Tibetan master Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche in Nepal, who's one of the teachers of almost every teacher of his generation. First sight of him was like seeing the sun rising, and I got to spend a little time with him, and not really much teaching, just a few pointers. But it's said in Vajrayana, you always see your teacher as the Buddha. After meeting Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche, I thought, well, all these other lamas are the Buddha, but Khyentse Rinpoche is something else again. So, and my wife has said when she met her Tibetan teacher the first time, she couldn't see anything else in the room. All she could see was him, and an experience she never had before or since with anybody else. So what I'm saying is, when you actually get immersed in the tradition, it starts to make a lot of sense. And the termas, especially, are very potent kind of teachings. And even with one particular deity, there can be dozens or hundreds or maybe even more sadhanas or meditation practices that have been revealed by the various treasure revealers over the centuries. So that's why I say there could be 40,000 or even 40 million. And a lot of these treasure teachings were revealed in their times and then said to be reconcealed, either reconcealed in the space of enlightened mind or in the actual physical location, because the conditions weren't right for them to be taught. And then sometimes they're rediscovered later on. And I realized this could be a lot to swallow. So the third point, there was little hardship. This also can be taken with some salt. Little hardship means going to the classification of the vehicles. So it's said by the Sutra Path, either of foundational vehicle or great vehicle, that it takes 3 immeasurable aeons to attain Buddhahood. Whereas in the tantric vehicles and in Nyingmapa, there are 6, 3 outer tantras, 3 inner tantras, and he'll be talking mostly about the inner tantras. where the outer tantras are more dealing with ritual and bodily actions, purification, and so forth. And the inner tantras are more what's taught in the West these days. So it said the outer tantras, Buddhahood can be attained in 16, 9, or 7 lifetimes, and the inner tantras, 3 lifetimes or 1 lifetime. So it means with little hardship means not that you don't have to practice hard or you can just do whatever you want, but that it won't take you 3 aeons. So in the um, lineage or the pantheon of great practitioners such as Milarepa, I think a common name to people who have followed Buddhism, read of incredible austerities and rivaling what the Buddha went through on his path, which led him to renounce austerity and extreme austerity and self-mortification. So it's certainly not a path of taking it easy. And part of Milarepa's story is that when he first set out to learn the Buddhist teachings or the Dharma, he met a teacher of the great perfection who said, I have a path for enlightenment in 1 lifetime. Not only that, to hear it in the morning is to become a Buddha in the morning. To hear it in the evening is become a Buddha in the evening. So Milarepa thought, great. He listened to some teachings, then he went back and lay down and went to sleep. And he woke up, he still wasn't a Buddha. So he went back to the teacher, said, what's the deal here? Teacher said, well, I see you are not ready for this path. You have too much karmic obscuration. You'll have to go find Marpa the translator and sweat it out with him. He didn't exactly say it that way, but that's what it led to. And one Tibetan teacher has said that instantaneous enlightenment can occur just when hearing the teachings or contemplating and meditating for the first time, but maybe that's 2 or 3 people out of 100,000. So again, going on to the next point of for beings of higher faculties, uh, we all would like to think of ourselves that way. And when I was in Santa Cruz, California, it was the so-called spiritual supermarket where seemingly one great enlightened teacher after another was coming, that a friend of mine said, these guys are really clever. They say they have the most profound and secret teachings, so they attract all these very proud people and can humble them to listen to the teachings, and possibly teachings can penetrate their minds because they think they're special and they're getting something special that's marked just for them. So to move out of the realm of theory, I'd like to go into some concrete examples, um, specifically experiences that are common to everybody, maybe the most common experiences, specifically eating and dying. So, say eating first, the simplest in Theravada, particularly in monastic tradition, we're taught to meditate on impurity and specifically with food, we don't take it for pleasure, take it solely to keep the body alive, to support it to practice on the path to liberation. And then monks in particular would always recite verses of thanks and benediction and blessing afterwards for the lay people who offered the food. In Mahayana, which I think in the West, when we talk of Mahayana, mostly people are familiar with Zen, so which I did practice um, in my own haphazard, flaky way for a few years. And the particular meal chant we used to do at the meditation retreats begins with innumerable labors brought us this food. We should know how it comes to us. And then contemplating that, are we worthy of this offering? And then it should inspire us to practice for the benefit of all beings. In Vajrayana, just like anything else, food should be seen as something pure. And before taking food, we usually would visualize our personal or root teacher in our throat, and usually in the idealized form of Padmasambhava or whoever is used and whoever is the main figure in particular lineage. In Nyingmapa, it's Padmasambhava, and offering food as nectar to him, and then you can expand the visualization that he takes it and blesses your body and your energy channels and so forth, which I don't want to go into too much. But there are various offering verses. So the offering verse that I like to use, simple 4 lines: food and drink are beginninglessly pure. They are the beginningless great offering substances. Blessing with Om Ah Hung and Ha Ho Ri, which are called seed syllables, they become the flowless nectar of great bliss. Then we take this food. And also, when eating meat, meaning the flesh of any sentient being, can bless with the mantra Om Ami Dewa Ri, the mantra of the Buddha Amitabha. And I should mention that in Tibet, they had a pretty limited food supply, and being vegetarian was something very challenging, although a few of the great teachers in Tibetan history were ardent vegetarians. Um, Not many were. And when the lamas came to the West, they brought their meat eating with them. But over the years, many of them have become very strict vegetarians and vegan. But even the Dalai Lama has been told by his doctors that he does need to take some meat. So, and my root teacher did say there is always some fault and negativity in taking meat. So we ameliorate it with good motivation and blessing the animal that the meat came from with various skillful means, such as the mantra of the Buddha Amitabha. So moving on to dying, the time of death, which is a bigger subject. So in Theravada, the ideal, or what's considered full enlightenment for us, is the arhat, someone who has extinguished the so-called defilements or mental afflictions of uh, desire, hatred, and delusion. And if you ask what happens to an arhat, or where does arhat go at the time of death, it's like asking, when you blow out a candle, where has the flame gone? So in Theravada, as mentioned, we meditate on impurities such as the impurity of the body, and can meditate on the dissolution of the body after death, on decaying of the body. And monks would often go to charnel grounds to meditate. And in monasteries, meditation monasteries in Thailand, you'll often see a skeleton in a glass case to remind us of death and impermanence. In Vajrayana, death is sometimes called the Great Liberation. And the Dalai Lama has said that at the time of death, the innate awareness becomes 9 times stronger, so that presents an opportunity to be liberated if there's recognition. So there's the concept of bardo, or in-between state. And bardo is a Tibetan term, and there is a Sanskrit word, antarapawa, for in-between state, but I wouldn't know if it's actually found in the Mahayana sutras or scriptures. But bardo means in-between state, and everything in ordinary existence is bardo. This life is a bardo in between birth and death. Then there's the bardo of death itself, and the bardo of suchness. I'll just give the names first, and then the bardo of becoming, or taking rebirth. And then the bardo of this life is sometimes subdivided into bardo of dream and the bardo of meditation. But here, talking about the bardo of death, when the last breath goes out, and it's talked about the elements dissolving into each other, and then into consciousness, consciousness into space. And as in most teachings, there's incredible detail. So I'm sort of glossing this over for simplicity's sake, but the point is that for an enlightened being, there is no death at the because he or she has already realized the deathless and enlightened mind. So it's like the sun setting and the moon rising. There's nothing to do. For someone on the path, depending on their habituation to nature of mind through their meditation, the primordially pure nature will appear. For someone with no familiarity, it will be just like a finger snap. And then the further stages of the process take place. But depending on your familiarity in meditation, it can last as long as half an hour. And then by recognizing it, the being is liberated, and that's it. There's no returning to the cyclic existence of suffering. And talking about familiarization, the Tibetan word for meditation, gom, means familiarization, because in the path, the view is pointed out and introduced by a teacher, and then through meditation, we familiarize ourselves with that. After the bardo of death, then if there's no recognition, then the bardo being or the consciousness goes into a faint, and sometimes called the black mind of near attainment. And waking from the faint, then all kinds of potentially terrifying experiences occur, maybe seeing wrathful forms, hearing what's called the sounds of 1,000 thunders. And in an ordinary being, this would cause fear and bewilderment and wanting to escape. For someone with some experience and understanding that can be evoked at this time, we recognize that these are just expressions of enlightened mind, or the spontaneously accomplished or present aspect of enlightened mind. And seeing that, one is liberated. If this can't be recognized, then one goes on to the border of becoming, and depending on past karmic accumulation and habit, one seeks rebirth in the various realms of existence, which talked about as 6, but for our purposes, we can consider animals and human beings the ones where we can see and are familiar with. And it's not so much a matter of choice as usually spoken of as being like a leaf blown in the wind. So sometimes you might get lucky. But again, Ajahn Chah once said he thought people are a little too anxious about it, that if you think about you grow up and you leave home, you might live in other places, you travel far and wide, but you always have home in mind as a place you can go back to. So he thought after death, it could be something like that, that because of familiarity, we come back to the human realm, although, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, the very first contemplation is precious human rebirth, that it's a rare occurrence. And this is also spoken of in the Theravada scriptures. The example of a blind turtle swimming in the great ocean and who comes to the surface once every 100 years or something like that. And if there's a wooden yoke floating on the surface, what are the odds of, or how long would it take before the turtle could surface and his head would poke through the yolk. But whatever the case, these are the bardos, and then enlightenment is said to be into the Dharmakaya, or the body of ultimate reality, or the Sambhogakaya, the body of complete enjoyment, usually what the deities are spoken of. And so in that state, one can continue on to full Dharmakaya realization, or Nirmanakaya, which is emanational being. And these can be in what's called pure lands of existence, or coming back to this world as a enlightened being, such as a bodhisattva. And again, in Tibetan Buddhism, we have what's called the tulku, or um, enlightened emanation being. And it seems to contradict the idea of the candle flame disappearing. But my own personal idea was, why not? Why wouldn't an enlightened being have control over where they wanted to go? And part of that is that the bodhisattva motivation helps enable them or propel them into those rebirths, which they're not taking for their own benefit, but for the benefit of beings. And sometimes it's spoken of like reflection of the moon in water, or reflection of the moon in water vessels. So the form body of an enlightened being appears in the world, and they don't always appear as teachers. They can appear as ordinary beings. They can appear as animals, or even inanimate objects, according to the needs of beings. And it's like the moon in the sky being reflected in water. And when there's no water, there's no reflection, so there's no moon. So water meaning suitable vessels or recipients of enlightened activity. But again, I don't want to get too deeply into theory. As my venerable wife pointed out, people can always read books about all these things, or God forbid, go on YouTube. But be that as it may, like to get into more distinctive features of Tibetan Buddhism, talking about Nyingmapa in particular again. And um, one last note, talking about the enlightened state and stages of the path, such as could be attained at time of death, that Theravada, typically you have the 4 stages, what's called stream entry, where you have your first glimpse of the enlightened state, and then you're in the stream, you're not turning back, but can take 7 lifetimes. And then once returner, meaning 1 lifetime, non-returner, and arhat. In Mahayana, they talk about 5 paths and 10 grounds or stages, bodhisattva stages, which are also talked about in Vajrayana. But in Nyingmapa in particular, sometimes talk about 13 stages or grounds, or 16, especially in the great perfection, which is a pinnacle, if you will, of Nyingmapa teachings, and also the four levels of an awareness holder. But I don't think we need to go into all of that. Just I'll mention the names, try to give an expanded perspective here. And one thing I'd like to quote is, again, from Ajahn Chah, who, when he would give teachings, he'd often say, don't just believe and don't just not believe. And the Buddha, in one very famous and oft-quoted scripture, the Kalama Sutta, said, don't take things on authority. Don't take things just because it's tradition, because your parents or teachers taught you, because I, meaning the Buddha, said it, but investigate for yourself and find out. So that applies here up to a point. But in the beginning, hearing about these things, please keep what we usually call an open mind. And keep in mind that all these things are skillful means. They're a means to an end. The Buddha talked about a raft that gets you across the water. When you get across the water to dry land, you don't carry the raft. So it was your skillful means to get across the water, or called the fearsome ocean of conditioned existence, or called samsara in Sanskrit. And again, beg forgiveness of the scholars. I tend to mix up Pali and Sanskrit terms, Pali being the scriptural Buddhism of Theravada, Sanskrit teachings of Mahayana, scriptures of Mahayana. So, distinctive features of Tibetan Buddhism and Nyingmapa, and the Sutra Mahayana is incorporated, especially what's called the mind training teachings, the altruistic mind of enlightenment, or bodhicitta, which is the absolute indispensable foundation, along with the mind of renunciation. And it's often pointed out that there can be no Vajrayana practice, certainly no result of Vajrayana practice, without altruistic motivation. And these mind training teachings, where you learn to put the welfare of others before yourself, and something you start out doing mentally through, called the wishing bodhicitta, and then put into practice as you develop it, and then ultimate bodhicitta being enlightened mind. And these are found in every lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, pretty much the same teachings, originally from a lineage called the Kadampa, which was incorporated into the Galupa, the latest of the four lineages, which is nominally what the Dalai Lama belongs to, although he's very non-sectarian, and particularly has had many teachers from Nyingmapa, including Ningo Kensei Rinpoche, whom I mentioned, and my own root teacher, Lama Gampo Tseiden Rinpoche. One of the very core teachings of mind training is called Tonglen, giving and taking, which I think it sounds better to say giving and taking. It's actually taking and giving, whereas you take on through visualization, you take on the suffering of beings, for example, in the form of black smoke entering your heart and extinguishing your self attachment, egotism, etc., selfishness, and then giving all your accumulated virtue and good fortune as white light to alleviate sufferings of beings. So when people hear about Tibetan Buddhism, when I first heard about it, first of all, it's extraordinary complex, all the various teachings and approaches. How do you sort it out? How do you know where to begin? Well, that's why you need a teacher. And I think in the West, especially, we have this egalitarian notion, and which really is often pride that I don't bow to any person. But if you think about it, whatever we learn in life, we learn from teachers or from those who know something we don't know. But somehow people resist the idea that the most difficult thing of all, which is changing your habits and attaining enlightenment, is something we can do on our own. Especially in Tibetan Buddhism, how do you find your way through all these practices and how do you make sense of them, even to start with? And another point is that it all seems very ritualistic and contrived. Well, in Theravada, there are rituals, there's a lot of contrivance, there are discursive meditations, such as meditation on the impurity of the body, or even devotional meditation on reciting the qualities of the Buddha or the Dharma, the teachings, or the Sangha, the enlightened community. And also in our day-to-day lives, they're full of ritual, the way we do things. If you think about it, I know when I make tea, I always have to do it in a very particular way to get the result I want. And all our experience is contrived. That's the teaching on the links, the 12 links in the wheel of existence that begin with ignorance. Then, as soon as there's any mental activity, we've already fallen into ignorance, and all the complications follow, leading up to all forms of suffering, death, and rebirth. So the Buddha said in the Theravada scriptures again, rough paraphrase, whatever the mind takes up repeatedly, it will incline in that way. So taking up various teachings and practices, even though they seem contrived and distorted, can lead us in a certain direction that would find difficult to go in on our own and to go in smoothly. So specifically, Vajrayana practice always begins with what's called empowerment or initiation, another mysterious idea or practice. And again, in Theravada, there's the term abhiseka, which Sanskrit abhisheka, which is empowerment, or wang in Tibetan. And one particular chant that we do in Theravada on the enlightenment of the Buddha, um, where he became victorious at the seat of the Bodhi tree, where he attained enlightenment, where Abhiseke Sabbabuddhanang, meaning receiving Abhiseka from all the Buddhas, sort of like sometimes called the anointment or consecration. So empowerment is sometimes taught as being consecrated or anointed as a member of the royal family, where you are empowered to do things that an ordinary citizen couldn't, specifically practice the tantric practices. And when I first heard about it, I thought something like a driver's license. Sometimes it's spoken of as planting seeds. And typically in an empowerment, the teacher will say he takes on the form of the specific enlightened being, or if it's not empowerment of a deity, he just rests in enlightened mind itself and is able to transmit what's called blessing from that state. And as I mentioned before, when you meet these kinds of teachers who are very compelling presences, these ideas become a lot more concrete or real. And many practitioners have had hundreds or thousands of empowerments. I would say I've had dozens over the years, and my own feeling is that I really received empowerment maybe twice. Um, I felt something very special had taken place. And the Dalai Lama has pointed out again that originally in India, these things weren't given widely and publicly. Traditionally, a teacher would maybe go to a remote place on a mountainside with a few disciples and even whisper the teachings and give empowerment to those he felt were ready. But the Dalai Lama has always often humorously criticized Tibetans for being too free with the teachings. But it's said in particular in the Nyingmapa tradition that after the diaspora, when they had to leave Tibet after the Chinese invasion, the senior Nyingmapa lamas got together and they said, if we don't start giving these teachings more freely, the lineage could die out. And I think they took personal responsibility for what the consequences might be. So it begins with empowerment, and usually we think first there's the understanding through teaching, then you would get empowerment to initiate you into the tradition. Here, the empowerment traditionally should come first, which traditionally you should have some faith and devotion at the beginning, which seems to counteract what the Buddha originally said. There are different levels of faith and belief, and there's blind faith briefly and faith through experience or unshakable faith. So we all begin with some blind faith, either through inspiration, by meeting beings or seeing images or hearing some teachings that can lead us into the arena, so to speak. And then the Dalai Lama talked about three kinds of belief, such as logical belief, just through reasoning, or things things you can obviously see. For example, if you see horns on the other side of a fence, you know there's an ox or moose or whatever kind of animal is present in your area. Well, let's say you see the animal, you know that's the animal. You see the horns, you can deduce what's there. You see smoke, you can deduce their fire, or you can understand through reasoning and have belief. Or you can rely on trusted sources, such as, when were you born? Well, everybody thinks they know, but you have no direct knowledge. You know because somebody told you, or because it's on your birth certificate. And Ajahn Chah, once one of his informal teachings where he would ramble around, and he said, I don't know when I was born. You know, people told me. And in Thailand at that time, they may not have had birth certificates, but he said, I just know I was born on this day because somebody told me. So again, great minds think alike. So you receive the empowerment, then you can get the teachings and do the practices. And without going through the whole progression of the path, the central practice is what's called Guru Yoga, meditating on the Guru. And when I first heard Guru Yoga, heard the term, I thought it meant serving the teacher, which is what we did a lot in monastic life, serving Ajahn Chah or whoever your teacher was at that time. And it's often pointed out that we don't serve the teacher because of his particular virtues, but because of what he represents, wearing the robes, which are called the banner of the Arhat, the or the flag of the enlightened ones. So we humble ourselves to serve them, wash their feet, fold their robes, provide their physical needs, bow to them, so on and so forth. And that is part of it. It's called pleasing the Guru with service, and pleasing the Guru with practicing what the Guru teaches. But specifically, Guru Yoga means meditating on the Guru in his enlightened form, where in essence it's your personal Guru. The form is in the Mappa Padmasambhava, but it can be the deity because all the deities are seen as Buddhas and as emanations of your Guru's mind. So with all this complexity, I'd like to say that the end point is simplicity. And to quote one of the great Nyingma masters of 20th century, who taught a lot of Westerners, Urgyen Tulku, can summarize the path as devotion to the Buddhas above, compassion for sentient beings below, and in the middle, where we are, in between, pure outlook. And specifically with the Dzogchen path, the great perfection meaning everything is perfect from the beginning, and then the means to realize that the second part of the Dzogchen deals specifically with the spontaneous presence, where one, through certain practices, one can actually see enlightened mind with one's eyes. its manifestations before one. And this is actually what's called the potency of enlightened mind, which is only occurs through these practices called leap over or at the time of death. And the end point of the leap over practices can be what's called the rainbow body, where the physical body actually dissolves into rainbow light, only leaving hair and nails behind. And it said because if you cut the hair and nails even while you're alive, you don't feel anything. They're inert. And again, this sounds like magic tricks or mythology, but there are actually documented cases in modern times. So I will leave it at that for your contemplation and go on to a little slideshow that can maybe make some of this a little more concrete. So first up, we have the refuge tree. And this is not the entire refuge tree, but it gets most of the essentials. And this was painted by my own teacher, by the way. Um, the central figure is Padmasambhava with consort, which again wouldn't go over very well in Theravada circles, but briefly, the what's called the Yab Yum, male and female in union, is a union of wisdom and skillful means, a representation. And behind him are the scriptures or the Dharma refuge. And above to the right and left are lineage gurus, and there are more lineage gurus above his head, which you can't see here, going to the primordial Buddha. And then on his right-hand side are the 8 bodhisattvas, to the left, 8 arhats, and immediate right is Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva or Buddha of compassion. Left, Vajrayogini, female Buddha or Dakini. Below are the Buddhas of the 3 times, past, present, and future, and then the 8 main meditational deities in the Nyingmapa lineage, and the wrathful protectors of the Dharma, who supposedly troublemakers or local spirits that Padmasambhava tamed when he first went to Tibet, so they would help and not hinder the introduction of this strange religion. Okay, so next is Amitayus, the Buddha of long life, again with consort, and sort of the twin of Amitabha, the Buddha of the Western direction. And at the time of death, there's a practice of transference of consciousness, which is called the path of sinners, where something you train in this lifetime, and then you can visualize ejecting your consciousness to the crown of your head in the form of light or syllable into the heart of Amitabha. And Amitayus is alternate form of Amitabha, the Buddha of the Western direction. The color red associated with the West, sunset, desire, and so forth. Desire purified becomes form of discriminating wisdom, and so forth, and holding the long life vase with the long life nectar. Next, lion-faced Dakini is Dakinis being the female Buddhas or helpers on the path, Buddhas of activity correspond to the Sangha. And this lion-faced Dakini, particularly an emanation of Padmasambhava, holding the chopper in her right hand to cut through delusion, the headdress of skulls, the trident skulls, necklace of skulls, meaning our dearest attachments, dried up and stomping on pride and ego, and flames of wrathful wisdom. So one Lama said, with the wrathful deities, you don't have any wiggle room to, pardon the expression, bullshit yourself. Or rationalize, but you really have to get down to it. Whereas the peaceful deities can make you a little too comfortable with yourself and your habits. So that's what the Lama actually said. Next is Shambhala, or Zambala, the wealth deity, holding the wish-fulfilling fruit, and in his right hand, a mongoose who swallowed a bunch of jewels in his left hand by squeezing the mongoose. He spits out the jewels. So it's done specifically to invoke prosperity, but it's just, really the true wealth, ultimate wealth, is enlightenment. So these deities or Buddhas, and meditating on them can bring enlightenment. They often think of a medical specialist is also a general practitioner. So these different forms of Buddha have their specialties, but they still are Buddhas to bring it to enlightenment. And Shambhala might be called semi-wrathful. This is Vajra Kilaya, or Vajra dagger, which he's holding in his central, in front of him, with his two central arms. And again, the mass of flames to burn up defilements and impurity. Above his head is the primordial Buddha, Kuntuzangpo, or all good, Samantabhadra in Sanskrit, not to be confused with the Mahayana Bodhisattva, Samantabhadra, and stomping on worldliness, or the worldly gods of attachment and prosperity, and attachment and fortune, happiness, and worldly happiness, so forth, and various symbolism with the 3 heads and 6 arms. So don't need to go into all of that here, but mainly the dagger cutting through obstacles, often done as an auxiliary practice for your main practice to cut through obstacles. And I think my own teachers spent 2 or 3 years in solitary retreat doing practice of Vajrakilaya. Then medicine Buddha, again, a healing practice, but the ultimate healing being enlightenment. And medicine Buddha also found in the Mahayana healing, Mahayana Sutra tradition, and in Tantra found in various forms and colors, and Padmasambhava and others as medicine Buddha. So that's it. And I hope this has made some sense, and maybe some of you can have gotten some inspiration to further look into these vast and amazing traditions. Thank you.